Snow fell gently over the small town of Woodstock, Vermont, blanketing everything in a soft, pristine white. The houses, with their glowing Christmas lights, looked like something out of a holiday postcard. It was Christmas Eve, and the residents of a cozy Victorian house on the edge of town were bustling with excitement. The old home, nestled amidst towering pines, belonged to the Murphys, a close-knit family known for hosting the most magical Christmas celebrations every year. This year, however, was a little different. The Murphys' youngest daughter, Lily, now 10, had taken it upon herself to organize the family's annual Christmas Eve gathering. A whirlwind of energy, she'd spent weeks meticulously planning every detail, from the snowflake-shaped sugar cookies to the decorations hanging on their towering Christmas tree. Everything had to be perfect. As the family of five scurried about making final preparations, their cat, Oscar, lounged on the windowsill in the living room. He was a handsome gray tabby with sharp green eyes and a calm demeanor that could soothe even the busiest of days. But tonight, even Oscar seemed to feel the electricity in the air. His tail flicked lazily as he watched the snowflakes drift by outside, occasionally glancing back at the chaos unfolding in the house. Lily darted from room to room in a flurry, carrying trays of cookies and pointing out decorations that needed adjusting. Her older brother, Max, grudgingly strung lights around the fireplace, muttering under his breath about how he'd rather be snowboarding. Their mother, Sarah, was busy basting the turkey in the kitchen, while their father, Tom, carried armfuls of firewood to ensure the house stayed warm and welcoming. The smell of cinnamon, pine, and roasting turkey filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of Christmas carols playing on the stereo. But amid the warmth and laughter, there was a sense of unease lurking in the shadows, though no one could quite put their finger on why. Outside, the wind howled louder than usual, and the woods behind the house seemed darker, their towering trees bending and creaking under the weight of the snow. Oscar, ever observant, sat up straighter on the windowsill, his ears twitching as if picking up on something no one else could sense. As the clock ticked closer to 8 p.m., the first guests began to arrive. Cousins, uncles, and aunts spilled into the house, their laughter and chatter filling the space with life. Coats were hung, boots lined up by the door, and presents were stacked under the glowing tree. Lily beamed with pride at the sight of her family enjoying the evening she had worked so hard to plan. But Oscar wasn't so easily distracted. While everyone else reveled in the holiday spirit, the gray tabby had grown increasingly restless. He hopped down from the windowsill and padded silently to the front door, his nose twitching. Something wasn't right. He could feel it deep in his bones, an unsettling sensation that made his fur stand on end. Tom noticed Oscar sitting by the door, his green eyes fixed intently on the crack between the door and the floor. "What's the matter, buddy?" Tom asked, scratching behind Oscar's ears. But the cat didn't respond. Instead, he let out a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down Tom's spine. "Dad, what's Oscar doing?" Lily asked, pausing as she carried a tray of hot chocolate to the dining room. "Probably just saw a squirrel or something," Tom replied, trying to dismiss the unease creeping into his own chest. But as the minutes passed, Oscar's behavior grew more erratic. He paced back and forth by the door, his growls becoming louder and more insistent. His tail puffed up like a bottle brush, a clear sign that something was wrong. Sarah peeked her head out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "What's going on out here?" "It's Oscar," Tom said, frowning. "He's acting strange. Maybe there's an animal outside." The family gathered near the door, peering out into the dark, snowy night. But the only thing they could see was the gentle glow of the Christmas lights on the porch, illuminating the falling snow. There was no sign of any animal or person outside. "Maybe we should let him out," Max suggested, shrugging. "No way," Lily said firmly, clutching Oscar to her chest. "It's too cold, and something could hurt him." Oscar wriggled free from her grasp, his ears pinned back. He darted toward the living room, where the Christmas tree stood proudly in the corner. The room was warm and inviting, with the fire crackling in the hearth and stockings hanging from the mantel. But the cat's attention wasn't on the tree or the stockings or even the roaring fire. His piercing green eyes were locked on the large bay window overlooking the backyard. Lily followed him, her heart pounding. "What is it, Oscar?" she whispered. And then she saw it. Just beyond the window, barely visible against the snowy backdrop, was a shadowy figure. It moved slowly, almost deliberately through the yard, heading toward the house. Lily's breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled back. "Dad!" she screamed. The laughter and chatter in the house came to an abrupt halt as everyone turned to look at her. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Tom asked, rushing into the room. There's someone outside," she stammered, pointing to the window. The family gathered around the window, their faces pale as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. The figure was closer now, its movements strange and jerky, as if it didn't belong in the serene winter landscape. Oscar stood his ground in front of the window, his body rigid and his eyes unblinking. He let out another growl, louder this time, a sound that sent a wave of fear rippling through the room. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. For the first time that night, the warmth and joy of Christmas were replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The Murphys had no idea what or who was lurking outside their home. But one thing was certain: Oscar wasn't about to let it ruin their Christmas. Tom bolted to the front door, locking it and double-checking the deadbolt. Max pulled the curtains closed on every window in the living room, his movements quick and nervous. The guests, sensing the tension, huddled together in uneasy silence. Sarah grabbed Lily and pulled her close, her arms wrapped protectively around her daughter. "Tom," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who do you think it is? Should we call the police?" Tom glanced out through the peephole in the front door, but all he could see was the glow of the porch lights illuminating the thick snowfall. "Maybe it's just someone who got lost," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'll check the back door. Max, stay here and watch over the girls." As Tom moved toward the kitchen, Oscar darted ahead of him, his sleek gray form disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. The cat's growls had subsided, replaced by a tense, deliberate silence. It was as though Oscar was stalking something, his every movement purposeful and precise. "Dad, wait!" Max called, but Tom was already out of sight. Oscar reached the back door first, his nose pressed against the gap between the door and the floor. Tom knelt down beside him, squinting through the frosted glass window. For a moment, everything seemed still. The only sound was the faint crackling of the fire in the living room and the distant murmur of worried voices. And then he saw it, a hand, pale, gloved and trembling, pressed against the glass. Tom stumbled back, his heart pounding. "Sarah, call the police!" he shouted, his voice breaking the fragile quiet of the house. Oscar hissed, his back arching as he bared his teeth. The hand lingered for a moment before disappearing, leaving only a faint smudge on the frosted glass. Tom's hands shook as he reached for the lock, double-checking it. "What is it? What's happening?" Sarah called from the living room, clutching her phone in one hand while Lily clung to her side. "There's someone outside," Tom said, his voice grim, "and they're trying to get in." Panic spread through the house like wildfire. The guests whispered among themselves, their eyes darting toward the windows and doors. Some of the younger children began to cry, their parents doing their best to comfort them. Lily, wide-eyed and trembling, looked up at her mother. "Mom, is it Santa?" she asked, her voice small and hopeful. Sarah shook her head, her throat tight. "No, sweetie, it's just someone who's lost. Everything's gonna be okay." But it didn't feel okay. In the kitchen, Tom grabbed a fire poker from the hearth and held it tightly, his knuckles white. He turned to Oscar, who stood by the door like a sentry, unflinching and focused. "You see anything, boy?" Tom muttered, as if expecting the cat to answer. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the house, followed by the sound of glass shattering. Screams erupted from the living room as everyone turned toward the source of the noise. Max ran into the kitchen, his face pale. "Dad, the window in the dining room, it's broken." Tom's heart sank. Whoever, or whatever, was outside wasn't waiting for an invitation. The family rushed to the dining room, where the cold night air was already seeping through the jagged hole in the window. Snowflakes swirled inside, landing on the hardwood floor. The curtains flapped in the wind, and the smell of pine and winter filled the room. "Everyone, stay back," Tom ordered, holding the fire poker like a weapon. Oscar, however, didn't retreat. The cat moved closer to the broken window, his tail low and his body tense. His green eyes scanned the darkness outside, unblinking and alert. "Tom, what do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Before Tom could answer, a shadow moved just beyond the broken window. It was quick, almost too quick to see, but it was there. The guests gasped, and Lily let out a small cry as she buried her face in her mother's sweater. "Oscar," Lily called, her voice breaking. But the gray tabby was already in motion. With a sudden burst of speed, he leapt onto the windowsill, his fur bristling and his claws extended. He let out a fierce yowl, a sound so loud and guttural it silenced the entire room. The shadow stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. And then, the intruder stepped into view. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with a ragged coat and wild eyes. His face was partially obscured by a scarf, but his gaze was unmistakable, desperate and unhinged. He carried a crowbar in one hand, its metal surface glinting in the faint light. "Please," the man said, his voice muffled and strained. I need to get warm." Tom tightened his grip on the fire poker, stepping in front of his family. "You need to leave," he said firmly. "Now." The man didn't move. His eyes darted around the room, landing on the glowing Christmas tree, the warm fire, and the frightened faces of the Murphys and their guests. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said, though the crowbar in his hand told a different story. Oscar growled low in his throat, his tail flicking dangerously. He crouched lower on the windowsill, ready to pounce. "Listen," Tom said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "If you leave now, no one will get hurt, but if you try anything..." Before he could finish, the man took a step closer, his boots crunching on the broken glass. Oscar didn't wait. With a lightning-fast leap, the gray tabby launched himself at the man, claws outstretched. A ferocious yowl filled the air as Oscar landed squarely on the intruder's chest, his claws sinking into the man's coat. The man let out a startled cry, stumbling backward as he tried to swat the cat away. Chaos erupted in the dining room. Guests screamed, Sarah pulled Lily closer, and Tom rushed forward, his fire poker raised. But Oscar didn't let up. He clawed and hissed, his small body a blur of gray fur and pure determination. The man dropped the crowbar, his hands flailing as he tried to shake Oscar off. "Get it off me!" he shouted, his voice panicked. Tom seized the opportunity, grabbing the crowbar and kicking the man backward. "Get out of my house!" he roared. The intruder stumbled through the snow, clutching at his torn coat as he retreated into the darkness. Oscar leapt from his chest at the last second, landing gracefully in the snow before darting back inside. Tom slammed the broken window shut, his chest heaving. Oscar strutted back into the room, his tail held high and his green eyes gleaming with triumph. Lily ran to him, scooping him up despite Sarah's protests. "Oscar, you're a hero," she cried, hugging the cat tightly. The guests erupted into cheers, their fear giving way to relief and admiration. Even Max, who had spent the entire evening teasing Lily about her obsession with Oscar, gave the cat a grudging nod of respect. But Oscar didn't care about the applause. He was already back on the windowsill, his sharp eyes scanning the snowy yard for any sign of the intruder. He wasn't going to let anything ruin Christmas. The house was buzzing with nervous energy as the guests tried to process what had just happened. Though the immediate threat seemed to have passed, the fear lingered, palpable in the air. The dining room was now a mix of chaos and relief. Broken glass littered the floor, the cold winter air seeped through the boarded-up window where Tom had hastily hammered a piece of plywood, and the glow of the Christmas tree felt strangely dimmer in the aftermath of the intruder's retreat. Oscar, however, remained vigilant. Despite the applause and admiration from the guests, he hadn't relaxed. He sat near the front door now, his green eyes locked on it like a sentinel. His tail flicked back and forth methodically, and his ears twitched at the faintest noise. To everyone else, the man was gone. But to Oscar, the threat wasn't over. Not yet. Lily sat cross-legged on the rug in the living room, holding Oscar in her lap and whispering to him like he was her own personal guardian angel. "You were so brave, Oscar," she murmured, stroking his soft gray fur. "I knew you were special, but tonight, you were amazing." Sarah walked over with a blanket and draped it over Lily's shoulders. "Sweetheart, why don't you come sit with everyone else? Let Oscar rest." Lily shook her head. "Oscar doesn't want to rest. He's still watching the door." Sarah exchanged a worried glance with Tom, who was busy sweeping up the broken glass. Most of the guests had gathered in the kitchen, sipping hot cocoa and speaking in hushed tones. Max, ever the skeptic, leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. "You really think he'll come back?" Max asked, his voice heavy with doubt. Tom sighed, setting the broom aside. "I don't know, but I'm not taking any chances." "What would he even want? We don't have anything valuable here," Max continued, gesturing to the modest decorations and family heirlooms scattered throughout the house. "It's not about what he wants," Sarah said quietly. "It's about what we have. A warm home, a family, safety. Sometimes that's enough for someone desperate." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. As the family tried to regain their sense of normalcy, Oscar suddenly bolted upright. His ears swiveled toward the back door, and his body went rigid. Lily froze, following his gaze. "Mom, he hears something," she whispered. Everyone stopped. Even the murmurs from the kitchen faded as the guests noticed the change in the room's energy. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, but beneath it, there was something else. A faint scraping sound, like metal dragging against wood. Tom grabbed the fire poker again, his heart pounding. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice low and firm. But Oscar had no intention of staying put. The cat leapt from Lily's lap and darted toward the back door, his movements swift and silent. Tom followed closely, his grip tightening on the fire poker. When he reached the back door, Tom saw it, the crowbar. It was wedged between the door and the frame, prying it open inch by inch. A hand reached through the gap, fingers fumbling for the lock. Without thinking, Tom slammed the fire poker down onto the crowbar, knocking it loose and sending it clattering to the floor. "I told you to leave," he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. The hand withdrew, and for a moment there was silence. Then, from the other side of the door, the man's voice came, low and desperate. "I just want to come in, just for a little while, please." Tom's anger wavered, replaced by an uncomfortable mix of fear and pity. He tightened his grip on the fire poker, glancing down at Oscar, who stood beside him with his fur bristling. "You need to leave," Tom said again, his voice firm but quieter this time. The man didn't respond. Instead, there was a sudden crash as he threw his weight against the door, shaking it violently. Tom stumbled back, his heart racing. Oscar sprang into action. With a furious hiss, he launched himself at the door, slamming his small body against it with surprising force. The sound startled the man on the other side, and he stopped, seemingly taken aback by the ferocity of the cat's attack. But Oscar wasn't done. He clawed at the door, his growls low and menacing, as if daring the intruder to try again. The man cursed under his breath, and his footsteps retreated into the snow. Tom exhaled shakily, his hands trembling as he lowered the fire poker. "He's gone," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince himself or everyone else. Oscar, however, wasn't convinced. He sat by the door, his tail flicking and his ears alert. Back in the living room, the family tried to regroup. Tom called the local police, explaining the situation and asking them to send someone to patrol the area. The guests huddled together, their earlier excitement now replaced by an air of unease. "Do you think he'll come back again?" Max asked, his voice unusually quiet. "I don't know," Tom admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But I think we need to be ready." The hours dragged on, and midnight came and went. Despite the police officer who arrived to survey the property and assure them everything was secure, no one felt truly safe. The celebration that had once been filled with laughter and joy was now subdued, the once vibrant spirit of Christmas overshadowed by fear. And yet, through it all, Oscar never wavered. As the guests gradually began to leave, some heading home early, others deciding to stay the night for safety, Oscar continued his silent watch. He moved between the windows and doors, his sharp eyes scanning the snowy yard for any sign of movement. He was tireless, determined, and utterly fearless. It was well past 2 a.m. when Lily finally fell asleep on the couch, clutching a throw pillow and wrapped in the blanket Sarah had given her. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the living room in a soft, flickering glow. Tom and Sarah sat together in the armchair, their exhaustion evident in their slumped shoulders and heavy eyelids. And yet, Oscar stayed awake. He perched on the windowsill, his gray fur blending into the shadows, his green eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the footprints and broken glass from earlier in a pristine white layer. For the first time that night, the house was quiet. Oscar's ears twitched as he heard a faint sound, a branch snapping, far off in the woods. His tail flicked, but he didn't move. Whatever was out there, he was ready for it. Because this was his family. This was his home. And he wasn't going to let anyone or anything ruin it. Morning broke over Woodstock, Vermont, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of gold and pink. It should have been the kind of Christmas morning that felt like magic, filled with the promise of unwrapping gifts, the smell of freshly baked cinnamon rolls, and the joy of being surrounded by loved ones. But inside the Murphy house, the events of the previous night still lingered like a heavy cloud. Lily stirred on the couch, blinking sleepily as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window. Her blanket had slipped to the floor, and Oscar was perched on the armrest beside her, his vigilant green eyes fixed on the front door. He hadn't moved all night. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. "You stayed up all night, didn't you?" she whispered, reaching out to stroke Oscar's fur. It was soft and warm beneath her fingers, a comforting contrast to the cold fear that still sat in her chest. Oscar glanced at her briefly, then returned his gaze to the door, as if to say, someone had to. Tom and Sarah were already awake, though their faces bore the telltale signs of a restless night. Tom stood by the broken dining room window, now boarded up with thick plywood, while Sarah busied herself in the kitchen, her movements tense and deliberate. Max shuffled in from the hallway, his hair sticking up at odd angles. "Any sign of him?" Max asked, his voice hushed. Tom shook his head. "No, the officer said they'd send a patrol car by again this morning, but nothing yet." "I don't think he'll come back," Sarah said, though she sounded more like she was trying to reassure herself. Lily clutched Oscar tighter. "He better not. Oscar won't let him." Max rolled his eyes, though there was no real malice in it. "Yeah, I'll admit, your cat's kind of a beast. I've never seen anything like that." "He's not just a cat," Lily said fiercely. "He's my protector." Tom smiled faintly, ruffling her hair. "He's everyone's protector. We're lucky to have him." As the family tried to settle into the rhythms of Christmas morning, the tension in the house began to ease, if only slightly. They opened presents in the living room, their laughter cautious but genuine. Lily squealed with delight when she unwrapped a new sketchbook and a set of colored pencils, immediately declaring she was going to draw a portrait of Oscar. Oscar, for his part, accepted the attention with his usual calm grace. He lounged near the Christmas tree, his tail curled around him like a question mark, his ears swiveling occasionally toward the faint creaks and groans of the old house. Even as the family laughed and exchanged gifts, he didn't fully relax. It wasn't until late afternoon, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, that the peace of the day was disrupted. Tom was outside shoveling the walkway, while Sarah prepared the Christmas dinner. Lily and Max were at the kitchen table, working on their respective projects, Lily sketching Oscar with her new pencils, and Max fiddling with the drone he'd gotten for Christmas. The warmth of the kitchen and the smell of roasting turkey made it feel, for the first time in hours, like Christmas again. But Oscar's sudden growl shattered the illusion. Lily's head snapped up, her heart pounding. Oscar was on the windowsill again, his body tense, his tail flicking wildly. His green eyes were locked on something outside. "Max," Lily said urgently, tugging on her brother's sleeve. "Look." Max followed her gaze and frowned. "It's probably just a deer or something. Relax." But Lily wasn't convinced. She slid out of her chair and moved to stand beside Oscar, peering out the window. At first, all she could see was the snow-covered yard and the trees swaying gently in the wind. But then she spotted it, a figure, partially obscured by the shadows of the woods. "Max, it's him," she whispered, her voice shaking. Max stood up so fast his chair tipped over. "Dad!" he yelled, running toward the front door. Tom burst into the house moments later, snow still clinging to his boots and coat. "What is it? What's wrong?" "It's him," Max said, pointing toward the window. "He's back." Tom's face darkened. He grabbed his phone and dialed the police, his voice low and urgent as he explained the situation. "Yes, the same man from last night. He's back. Please send someone quickly." The tension in the house returned full force, but this time it was different. This time, there was no panic, only determination. "Everyone stay inside," Tom said, pulling the fire poker from its place by the hearth. I'll keep an eye on the yard until the police get here." But before he could move, Oscar leapt down from the windowsill and bolted toward the back door. "Oscar, no!" Lily cried, chasing after him. The cat reached the door and began pawing at it furiously, his growls low and menacing. His behavior was so uncharacteristic, so intense, that it gave Tom pause. "What is it, boy?" he asked, crouching down beside him. Oscar let out a sharp yowl and pressed his body against the door. Tom hesitated for a moment, then opened the door just a crack. The cold air rushed in, stinging his face, and he scanned the yard carefully. At first, he saw nothing. But then, to his shock, he spotted the man, sitting slumped against a tree at the edge of the woods. He wasn't holding a weapon. He wasn't trying to break in. He wasn't even standing. He was just sitting there, shivering violently, his head bowed. "Dad?" Lily whispered, clutching the edge of Tom's coat. "It's okay," Tom said quietly, though he wasn't entirely sure if that was true. He stepped outside cautiously, Oscar at his heels. The cat moved with purpose, his growls softening into a low, throaty rumble. As Tom approached the man, he realized just how bad off he was. His coat was torn, his face pale, and his lips blue from the cold. He looked up weakly as Tom drew near, his eyes hollow and filled with something Tom hadn't expected. Regret. "I didn't mean to scare anyone," the man rasped, his voice barely audible. I didn't know where else to go." Tom's anger dissolved, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. He crouched down, keeping his voice calm. "Why didn't you just ask for help?" The man shook his head, tears freezing on his cheeks. "People don't help people like me." Oscar moved closer, his tail swishing as he sniffed the man cautiously. After a moment, he sat down, his green eyes unblinking but no longer hostile. Tom sighed. "Come on," he said, extending a hand. "Let's get you inside before you freeze to death." The man was sitting on the couch now, wrapped in a thick blanket, while Sarah handed him a steaming mug of hot cocoa. His name was Peter, and his story was one of loss, desperation, and the cold indifference of the world he'd been surviving in. He'd lost his job months ago, then his home shortly after. For weeks, he had been living out of his car, which had broken down a few miles from the Murphys' house. He'd been wandering ever since, trying to find shelter from the unrelenting cold. Peter's wild, desperate actions the night before had been driven by fear. Fear of freezing to death, fear of being invisible, fear that no one would care enough to help him. But now, sitting in the warmth of the Murphy home, surrounded by people who had chosen compassion over anger, he looked like a different person. Tom sat across from him, his face thoughtful. "You should have just knocked," he said quietly, though there was no judgment in his voice. Peter nodded, his hands trembling as he held the mug. "I thought you'd turn me away," he admitted. "People usually do." Lily sat on the rug at Peter's feet, her sketchbook in hand. She was finishing a drawing of Oscar, his sharp green eyes glowing with determination, his body poised and ready to protect. "Oscar didn't turn you away," she said softly, looking up at Peter with wide, earnest eyes. Peter smiled faintly, glancing at the gray tabby who now sat curled up on the armrest of the couch, his tail flicking lazily. "That cat, he's something else," Peter said, his voice filled with genuine awe. "He's our hero," Lily said proudly. The police eventually arrived, but after hearing Peter's story and seeing the Murphys' willingness to help him, they decided not to press charges. Instead, they connected him with a local shelter where he could find warmth, food, and resources to get back on his feet. As Peter prepared to leave, he knelt down in front of Oscar, who was sitting by the front door. "Thank you, little guy," he said, his voice breaking. "You saved me from myself." Oscar blinked slowly, a gesture that Lily swore was the cat equivalent of saying, "You're welcome." As the door closed behind Peter, the family gathered in the living room. The house was quiet again, the tension finally gone. Tom stoked the fire. Sarah poured another round of cocoa, and Max, for once, didn't complain about being stuck at home. Lily curled up on the couch with Oscar in her lap, stroking his fur as she looked out the window at the snow-covered yard. "Do you think he'll be okay, Mom?" she asked. Sarah smiled, her gaze softening as she looked at her daughter. "I think so. Sometimes all it takes is one person or one cat to remind someone that they're not alone." The family fell into a comfortable silence, the warmth of the fire and the glow of the Christmas tree wrapping them in a cocoon of peace. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in quiet beauty. Oscar purred softly, his eyes half closed as he settled into Lily's lap. He had done his job. He had protected his family, not just from the intruder, but from the fear and despair that could have stolen their Christmas. And in doing so, he had reminded them, and Peter, that even in the darkest of nights, there is always light to be found.